It was 6 in the morning when Caroline's scream woke the entire apartment building. A scream so sharp, so full of fury, that it seemed to shake the walls of my own apartment and jolted every neighbor on the floors above and below me from their sleep. I heard her furious footsteps in the hallway, the metallic jangling of keys striking the lock over and over, and then her voice, breaking not with hysteria but with rage, as she pounded on my door with her closed fists. I was sitting in the living room, my hands crossed in my lap, staring at the door as if seeing it for the first time. I had slept barely 2 hours that night, but not from fear. I slept little because, finally, after months of humiliation and silence, I had done what I should have done from the very beginning. I changed the locks. All of them. Every single one of the 3 locks that protected the entrance to my home. Caroline's scream ripped through the silence again. "Susan, open this door right now." Her voice was a hurricane of rage. She was hitting the wood with so much force that I feared the door might give way, but it did not. It was a solid door, bought with the money I earned cleaning other people's houses for 20 years. A door that had always been open for my son, for my family, for anyone who wanted to enter with love and respect. But that morning, that door remained closed. I heard Matthew come running up the stairs. His steps were heavy, clumsy, as if he had just woken up. "What's wrong? What's going on?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Caroline answered him between feigned sobs and uncontrolled shouts. "Your mother changed the locks. My keys won't go in. I can't get into my own house." "My own house," she said, as if this apartment, which I bought alone after her father's death, as if these walls that I painted with my own hands, were hers. Matthew pounded on the door with his fist. "Mom, open up. Let's just talk about this." His voice was trying to sound conciliatory, but I knew that tone. It was the same one he used when he wanted me to give in, to be quiet, to accept the unacceptable. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of my 64 years in my knees, and walked toward the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, on the other side, listening to their voices mix with the murmuring of the neighbors who were beginning to peek out of their doors. "Mom, please," Matthew insisted. "I don't understand what's happening. Open the door and let's talk." I took a deep breath. My hand was trembling when I turned the deadbolt and opened it just a crack. Matthew was there, his hair messy and his eyes swollen with sleep. Behind him, Caroline stared at me with a fury she no longer tried to disguise. Her eyes were 2 black dots fixed on me, full of contempt. "How could you do this?" Matthew yelled, pushing the door with more force. I didn't back down. I stood firm, my back straight, even though everything in me wanted to collapse. I reached into the pocket of my housecoat and pulled out a white envelope, an envelope I had prepared the night before, with trembling but determined hands. I held it out to Matthew without a word. He took it suspiciously, looking at me as if I were a stranger. He slowly opened the envelope and pulled out the papers I had put inside. I watched his eyes scan the lines, his expression change from confusion to surprise, and then to something I couldn't identify. Shame, perhaps. Or fear. Caroline tried to snatch the papers from his hands, but Matthew pulled them away. "What is that? What did she give you?" she demanded, her voice shrill. Matthew didn't answer right away. He kept reading. And with every second that passed, his face grew paler. When he finally looked up, he stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and something resembling panic. "Mom, this can't be true." I nodded slowly. "It's true, every word." Caroline ripped the papers from his hands and began to read them with wide eyes. I watched her face turn from bright red to a ghostly white. The papers contained everything. Every credit card slip she had signed when she took money from my account without permission. Every text message where she insulted me and called me a burden. Every record of the time she had changed my phone's settings so I couldn't receive calls from my friends. It was all there, in black and white, with dates and proof that I had silently collected for months. There was also the copy of the deed to my apartment, showing I was the sole legal owner. And at the end, a letter from my lawyer explaining that any attempt to enter without my consent would be considered trespassing. Caroline dropped the papers onto the floor. Her mouth opened and closed several times, searching for a response that wouldn't come. Matthew bent down to pick them up, but his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold them. "Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know she," he began to say, but his voice broke. I looked at him steadily, without blinking. "Yes, you did, Matthew. You always knew." The silence that followed was dense, heavy as a block of cement. The neighbors were still peeking out of their doors, some with expressions of shock, others with quiet approval. Mrs. Davis, who lived in the apartment next door, gave me a discreet nod, as if telling me I had done the right thing. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had carried for so long I couldn't even remember what it was like to live without it. Caroline was the first to react. She turned on Matthew with renewed fury. "Do something. You're not going to let your mother do this to us." But Matthew just stared at the papers in his hands, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. "What do you want me to do, Caroline? It's all here. Everything you did is documented." She shoved him in the shoulder. "You're a coward. She's your mother. You have to take my side." I closed the door slowly, not slamming it, no drama. I just pushed it until the lock clicked into place with a soft but final sound. On the other side, I heard Caroline scream something else, but their voices couldn't reach me anymore. I walked away from the door and sat back down on the sofa, in the same spot where I had spent so many sleepless nights, wondering how I had ended up here, how I had allowed my own home to become a prison, how I had let my son and his wife treat me as if I were a piece of old furniture that was in their way. But that morning, as the sun began to filter through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, I knew something had changed. I was no longer the woman who accepted mistreatment in silence. I was no longer the mother who swallowed her tears so as not to bother her son. That morning, sitting on my sofa, with the echo of Caroline's screams still ringing in the hallway, I understood that I had reclaimed something I thought was lost forever. My dignity. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Susan Miller, and I am 64 years old. I know I look younger, or so the few people who still speak to me with kindness tell me. But the truth is that these last few years have aged me on the inside in a way no mirror can reflect. I've lived alone in this apartment for 3 years, although alone isn't exactly the right word. I lived invaded. I lived watched. I lived judged in every corner of my own home. But before I tell you how I came to change the locks on my door in the middle of the night, before I explain why my daughter-in-law screamed as if she were being murdered in front of the whole building, you need to understand who I am. Who I was before all this began. Because I wasn't always this quiet woman who let the humiliations pass. There was a time when I had a voice. There was a time when I was the owner of my own life. I was born in a small town where women learned from childhood that silence was a virtue and obedience, an obligation. I married young, at 19, to a good man who worked in construction. We moved to the city looking for a better life, and for 30 years, we built something together. It wasn't an easy life, but it was ours. We had Matthew when I was 23, and from that moment, my world revolved around that little boy with big eyes who looked at me as if I were the most important person in the universe. My husband died 8 years ago. A massive heart attack while he was lifting a beam on a job site. There was no time for goodbyes, no time for final words. One day he was alive, and the next he was gone. Matthew was 32 when he lost his father, and I remember him crying in my arms just like when he was a child. "I promise I'll take care of you, Mom," he told me that night. "You'll never be alone." And I believed him. I believed him with all my heart. After my husband's death, I was left with this apartment and a small pension that was barely enough to live on. For the first few years, I worked cleaning houses to supplement my income. I'm not ashamed to say it. I cleaned other people's bathrooms, ironed clothes that weren't mine, prepared meals in kitchens where I never sat down to eat. I did what I had to do to keep this roof over my head, to not be a burden to anyone. Matthew came to visit me every Sunday. He would bring donuts and coffee, and we would sit in this very living room and talk about his job, his plans, about life. They were good years, quiet years. I had learned to live with my husband's absence. I had learned to fill the silence of the house with the radio and with phone calls from my friends. I had my routine, my little pleasures. On Tuesdays, I went to the grocery store. On Thursdays, to the community center, where we took knitting classes. On Sundays to church. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was mine. 4 years ago, Matthew met Caroline. I remember the day he introduced her to me. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he showed up without calling, a little nervous, with a thin, well-dressed woman on his arm. "Mom, this is Caroline," he said with a huge smile. "She's very important to me." I greeted her with the warmth I always reserve for people who entered my home. I offered her coffee. I made her something to eat. I tried to get to know her. Caroline smiled a lot that afternoon, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked around my apartment with an expression I couldn't decipher at the time, but which I understand perfectly now. It was disdain. She looked at my old furniture, my faded curtains, my cheap knickknacks with the same disdain one looks at something dirty. But I didn't see it then. I only saw my son, happy, and that was enough for me. They got married 6 months later. It was a small, simple wedding in a hall they rented for a few hours. I wore the same dress I had worn to my cousin's wedding years before, because I didn't have money to buy a new one. Caroline looked me up and down when I arrived, and although she didn't say anything, I saw her lips pucker in a grimace of disapproval. Matthew didn't notice. He was too busy greeting guests, too happy to notice the discomfort on my face. The first few months of marriage, Matthew continued to visit me on Sundays, but with less and less frequency. "Caroline isn't feeling well," he'd say. Or, "We have plans." I understood, or at least I tried to. Newlyweds need their space, their time together. I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law everyone dreads. So I waited. I waited for his calls, his visits, any sign that I was still important in his life. It was Caroline who suggested they come live with me. It was her idea, although at first they presented it to me as if it were a genuine concern for my well-being. "You're too lonely, Mom," Matthew said one afternoon, sitting exactly where I'm sitting now. "Caroline and I think it would be better if we lived with you. That way we can take care of you, and you won't have to be alone in this big apartment." It seemed strange to me that suddenly my 2-bedroom apartment was so big, but I didn't say anything. The idea of having my son close again, of hearing voices in the house, of not waking up in absolute silence every morning, seduced me. I agreed. My God, how I regret agreeing. I told them yes, they could move in with me, that it would be wonderful to have him close. Matthew hugged me tight and told me I had made the right decision. Caroline smiled, but this time she didn't even try to feign warmth. It was a smile of triumph. I should have seen it then. I should have understood what that smile meant. They moved in on a rainy Saturday in March. They brought their things in boxes and bags, and all morning they filled my apartment with their presence. Caroline walked from one side to the other, giving orders, moving my furniture without asking, deciding what went and what didn't in every space. "This doesn't match," she said, pointing to the painting my husband had given me for our 10th anniversary. "This is too old," she commented, touching my sofa with her fingertips, as if it disgusted her. I tried to help, to participate in the organization of what was still my house, but Caroline pushed me aside with subtle gestures. "Go rest. Susan, we'll handle this." At first, I thought it was consideration, that they wanted to keep me from getting tired. But with every hour that passed, with every decision they made without consulting me, I began to feel something strange in my chest, a discomfort I couldn't name. That night, when they finally went to sleep in what had been my sewing room, I was left alone in the living room, looking at how my apartment had been transformed into something unrecognizable. My family photos had been put away in a box. My plants had been moved to the balcony. My magazines and my cookbooks were piled in a corner, waiting to be taken somewhere where they wouldn't be in the way. I sat on the sofa and cried silently, not yet understanding why I felt like an intruder in my own home. If I had known then what was to come, if I could have seen even a glimpse of the hell that was about to begin, I would have changed the locks that very night. But I didn't. Because I still believed that a mother's love could withstand anything. Because I still thought my son would protect me. Because I didn't yet know that sometimes family can be your worst enemy. The first few days after Matthew and Caroline moved in with me were strange, but not necessarily bad. I was trying to adapt to having people in the house again, to hearing voices and movement in the rooms. I got up early, as always, and made coffee for the 3 of us. Matthew would rush off to work with a piece of toast in his hand, kissing my cheek like he did when he was young. Caroline stayed in bed later, and when she finally came out of the room, she barely greeted me. I thought it was a matter of time, that eventually we would find a rhythm, a way of living together that worked for everyone. I gave her space. I didn't ask uncomfortable questions. I tried to be the discreet mother-in-law that all daughters-in-law want. I cooked their favorite meals, washed their clothes along with mine, kept the house clean and tidy. I did everything a mother does, hoping to receive even a crumb of affection or gratitude in return. The first week, Caroline spent most of the day out. She said she had errands, was visiting friends, needed to go shopping. I used those hours of solitude to regain some of the peace I had lost. I would sit on the balcony to drink my tea, call my friend Barbara to chat, watch my television shows, small moments where I could breathe without feeling like I was being watched. But that changed quickly, very quickly. The second week, Caroline started staying in the apartment more. She would sit in the living room with her phone, watching me out of the corner of her eye as I did my daily chores. At first, I paid no attention. I thought maybe she was just getting used to her new home, that she needed time to feel comfortable. But I soon understood that wasn't it. She was studying me, observing my every move like someone watching an animal in a zoo. One Tuesday morning, I was getting my bag ready to go to the grocery store when Caroline came out of the bedroom. "Where are you going?" she asked, in a tone that tried to sound casual but hid something else. "To the grocery store," I replied. Like every Tuesday, she crossed her arms and looked me up and down. "Do you need to go?" "I can do the shopping. You should rest." I smiled, thinking it was a kind gesture. "Don't worry. I like going. Besides, I know the vendors and they always give me a good deal." Caroline didn't insist that day, but I saw something in her eyes that unsettled me. Annoyance, perhaps, or something worse. I went to the store as always, bought the vegetables and meat, chatted with the people I knew. When I got home, Caroline was reorganizing my kitchen. She had taken all the pots and pans out of the cabinets and was putting them in different places. "What are you doing?" I asked, setting the grocery bags on the table. She didn't even turn to look at me. "Organizing. Everything is so cluttered in here." I felt a knot in my stomach. "But I know where everything is. I've had it this way for years." Caroline finally looked at me with that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, we all live here now, Susan. Things have to change." The way she said my name, without Mom or any term of endearment, hurt more than I wanted to admit. I didn't say anything else. I put the groceries away in silence, trying to memorize where she had put everything so I could find it later. When I finished, I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and took a deep breath, telling myself I was overreacting, that Caroline was just trying to feel useful, to make this house her home too. But something in my chest told me I was being naive. That night, during dinner, I tried to talk to Matthew about my day. I told him about the sales I found at the store, about how the cashier had asked about him. Matthew smiled and nodded, but he was barely paying attention. His eyes were fixed on his phone, answering messages while he ate. Caroline, sitting across from me, ate in silence, pushing the food around on her plate with her fork, as if she disliked it. "Don't you like it?" I asked, suddenly feeling insecure. I had made pot roast, one of Matthew's favorite meals since he was a child. Caroline looked up and stared at me with barely disguised annoyance. "It's too salty." Matthew finally tore his eyes from his phone. "I like it, Mom. It's delicious, as always." Caroline snorted. "Of course you like it. You're used to eating like this." There was something venomous in her tone, something that made me feel small. The following weeks were more of the same, but progressively worse. Caroline started making comments about everything, about how I cleaned the house, about how I organized things, about the way I dressed. "Are you going out like that?" she asked me one day when she saw me ready to go to church. I was wearing a simple dress, the same one I had worn every Sunday for years. "What's wrong with it?" I asked, checking myself in the hallway mirror. "Nothing," she said, shrugging. "It just makes you look older." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there feeling ugly and ridiculous. Matthew was never around when Caroline made these comments. She was careful. She waited until he left. until he was distracted, until he couldn't overhear. And when I tried to say something to him, when I tried to explain how his wife made me feel, he would brush it off. "You're being too sensitive, Mom. Caroline doesn't mean anything by it. She's just trying to help." But I knew it wasn't help. I felt it in my body, in the way my stomach tightened every time I heard her footsteps approaching, in how I had started to measure my every action, wondering if Caroline would find something to criticize. I was becoming invisible in my own home, and the worst part was that my son didn't see it, or didn't want to see it. One day, my friend Barbara came to visit. We had been friends for years, ever since our children went to elementary school together. She brought pastries, and we sat in the living room to chat like we always did. We were laughing, remembering old stories, when Caroline came out of her room. She didn't greet us. She just stood in the living room entrance, watching us with her arms crossed. Barbara tried to be friendly. "Hi, Caroline. How are you?" Caroline barely nodded. The silence became awkward. I tried to pick up the conversation, but Caroline was still there, observing us. Finally, Barbara left earlier than planned, promising to call me later. When I closed the door behind her, Caroline spoke. "I don't like you having people over without telling me." I looked at her, confused. "She's my friend. She comes over all the time." Caroline shrugged. "Well, you're not the only one living here anymore. You should ask for permission first." Permission. That word echoed in my head for days. I had to ask for permission to invite my friends into my own house. I had to ask for permission to move my own things. I had to ask for permission to exist in the space that I had paid for, that I had built with years of work and sacrifice. That night, lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not physical fear, but something deeper. Fear that I was losing my place in the world. Fear that my son had forgotten me. Fear that everything I had built was crumbling beneath my feet and I could do nothing to stop it. But I still did nothing. I still hoped things would get better on their own. I still believed that if I behaved, if I was patient, if I showed more love, everything would go back to the way it was. How wrong I was. How naive I was to think that silence would protect me. Because silence doesn't protect. Silence only makes you more vulnerable. It was in the 3rd month of living together that things went from being just uncomfortable to becoming unbearable. Caroline no longer bothered to hide her disdain for me. Her acidic comments became more frequent, more direct, more hurtful. And the worst part of all was that Matthew still didn't see it. Or worse, he saw it and chose to ignore it. One morning I got up early, as usual, and found Caroline already awake in the kitchen. She was making coffee, using my coffee maker, my favorite mug, the one my husband had brought me from a trip years ago. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. She barely grunted a reply. I went to the cabinet to get another mug and realized all my things had been moved again. "Where are the mugs?" I asked, opening different doors. Caroline took a sip of her coffee before answering. "I moved them. They were taking up too much space." I took a deep breath. "Where did you move them?" She pointed listlessly toward the top cabinet, the highest one, the one I could barely reach without standing on a chair. "Up there. It's more logical." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize the absurdity of her decision, but she just shrugged and walked out of the kitchen, my mug in her hand. I had to drag a chair over to reach my own mugs. My own mugs. In my own kitchen. As I stretched my arm, trying not to fall, I felt the humiliation welling up in my chest. It wasn't just about the mugs. It was about the message. It was about making me understand that I no longer had a voice or a vote in what happened under my own roof. That same afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. I needed air. I needed to escape those walls that felt more like a prison every day. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door when Caroline intercepted me. "Where are you going?" Her tone was an interrogation, not a casual question. "For a walk," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Why?" I looked at her, not understanding. "Because I want to. I need some fresh air." She frowned. "It's cold out. You'll get sick, and then Matthew will have to take care of you." I ignored her and left anyway, but her words followed me on my entire walk. The way she said, "Matthew will have to take care of you," as if I were an inevitable burden, something heavy my son would be forced to carry against his will. When I returned an hour later, Caroline was on the phone with Matthew, telling him that I had gone out alone even though she had warned me about the weather. "She doesn't listen to me," I heard her say. "She's just being stubborn. I don't know what we're going to do with her." Matthew came home that night with a worried look on his face. "Mom, Caroline told me you went out by yourself. Are you okay?" I nodded, confused by his alarmed tone. "Yes, I just went for a walk. I do it all the time." He exchanged a look with Caroline. "You're not as young as you used to be, Mom. You should let us know when you go out, just in case something happens." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression was serious. "I'm 64, Matthew, not 90. I can walk around the neighborhood by myself." Caroline chimed in from the sofa. "It's for your own good, Susan. Don't you understand that we worry about you?" There was something in her voice that sounded false, rehearsed, but Matthew nodded, supporting his wife's every word. I went to bed that night feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Somehow, without realizing it, I had gone from being the owner of the house to being a kind of child who needed supervision. In the following days, Caroline intensified her control. She started checking my phone calls. "Who is this number that called you 3 times?" she would ask, looking at my phone, which she had taken from the table without permission. "It's Barbara, my friend." Caroline made a face. "She calls you a lot. What do you two have so much to talk about?" I didn't answer. I didn't owe her an explanation, but I felt obligated to give one anyway. One Thursday, the day I went to the community center for my knitting class, I got ready as usual. I fixed myself up, grabbed my bag with my needles and yarn, and headed for the door. Caroline appeared, blocking my path. "Where do you think you're going?" I looked at her, tired. "To the community center. Like every Thursday." She shook her head. "Matthew asked me not to let you go out today. He said you looked tired." I felt my blood boil. "Matthew is at work." "When did he ask you that?" Caroline smiled smugly. "This morning. He sent me a text." I didn't believe her, but I had no way of proving it without causing a major conflict. I stayed home that day, sitting in my room, feeling the walls close in on me. When Matthew got home that night, I confronted him. "You told Caroline not to let me go out today." He looked at me, confused. "What?" "No, I didn't say that." Caroline entered the conversation, her voice sweet and worried. "Honey, yes, you did. You said your mom looked really tired, and it was better for her to rest." Matthew frowned, as if trying to remember. "Oh, right. Well, it was just a suggestion, Mom. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal, because that suggestion became a rule. The following week, Caroline again prevented me from going to the community center. "Matthew thinks it's better if you stay home. Besides, those women there just gossip. It's not good for you." I tried to call Barbara to explain why I hadn't been, but I couldn't find my phone. I looked all over the house until I finally found it hidden under some sofa cushions. "How did my phone get here?" I asked, holding the device. Caroline was cooking and didn't even turn around. "I don't know. Maybe you left it there and forgot." But I knew I hadn't left it there. I always left my phone on my nightstand. Always. I checked the device and discovered I had missed several calls from Barbara. When I tried to call her back, the phone wasn't working right. The screen would freeze, apps would close on their own. I asked Matthew to look at it. He took it, fiddled with it for a moment, and handed it back. "It's fine, Mom. You just have to restart it." But when I restarted it, I discovered my contacts had been erased. All of them. Years of phone numbers, names, addresses, everything was gone. I felt a surge of panic. "Matthew, my contacts are gone." He sighed impatiently. "You must have touched something by accident. These phones are complicated for you," Caroline added from the kitchen. "That's why we tell you to be careful, Susan. You're not exactly up to date with technology." I stared at the blank screen of my phone, feeling like I had lost more than just numbers. I had lost my connection to the outside world. I could no longer call Barbara, or the other ladies from the community center, or my distant cousins. I was isolated. I tried to recover some numbers by asking Matthew, but he was always busy, always in a hurry, always promising we would do it later. And later never came. I began to realize that with every day that passed, My world was getting smaller. My friends stopped calling because they thought I was ignoring them. My outings were reduced to going to the grocery store once a week, always accompanied by Caroline, who supervised every purchase I made. "You don't need that much soap," she would say, taking things out of my cart. "You're spending too much." But it was my money, my pension, the money I had earned with years of work. Still, I didn't have the strength to fight. Every confrontation left me exhausted, and Caroline always found a way to make me look like the unreasonable one, the difficult old woman who didn't understand what was best for her. One night, while I was washing the dishes after dinner, I heard Caroline and Matthew talking in their room. Their voices were low, but the walls in this apartment are thin. "She can't go on like this," Caroline was saying. "She's getting worse. She forgets things, leaves everything out. She can't take care of herself." Matthew mumbled something I couldn't hear. "We have to think about options," Caroline continued. "There are places for people like her, places where they can take better care of her." My hands trembled as I held the plate I was washing. Places for people like me. They were talking about me as if I were sick, as if I were incapable. And the most painful part was hearing my son consider those options. My own son, the boy I had raised alone after his father died, was discussing where to put me because his wife wanted him to. That night I cried until I fell asleep, and for the first time, I allowed a dark thought to cross my mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being difficult. Maybe I really did need more help than I wanted to admit. Maybe the best thing for everyone was for me to just disappear from their lives. Caroline's control over my life became absolute in the following months. It was no longer just about where I put the mugs or when I could go out. It was about every aspect of my existence. I had become a prisoner in my own home. And the most terrible part was that no one seemed to notice except me. She started to control my money. One day she told me it would be easier if she managed my finances. "That way you don't have to worry about paying bills, Susan. I'll take care of everything." Matthew supported the idea. "It's better, Mom. Caroline is very organized with money. Besides, this way you can rest." I didn't understand why I needed to rest from paying my own bills, something I had done for 40 years without a problem. But I was so tired of fighting that I agreed. I gave her access to my bank account. It was the biggest mistake I could have made. At first, everything seemed normal. The bills were paid on time. I received a monthly summary that Caroline would show me quickly before filing it away. But after 2 months, I started to notice that my pension wasn't stretching as far as it used to. When I tried to buy something simple, like a new pair of shoes because mine were worn out, Caroline told me there was no money available. "What do you mean there's no money?" I asked, confused. "My pension is $600 a month. I barely spend anything." Caroline looked at me with exaggerated patience, like someone explaining something to a small child. "You have to pay your share of the utilities, the food, the HOA fees. It all adds up." I froze. "My share of the HOA fees? But this is my apartment. I own it." Caroline smiled in that way that already set my nerves on edge. "Exactly. That's why you have to pay the maintenance, the property taxes, the utilities. Matthew and I chip in, but since it's your property, you have to cover most of it." Her words sounded logical on the surface, but something didn't add up. I tried to do the math in my head, but numbers had never been my strong suit, and Caroline knew it. I asked to see the receipts, the bank statements. She always had an excuse. "They're filed away, or I threw them out since they're paid. Don't worry about it. Everything is in order." When I insisted more firmly, she told Matthew. That night, my son spoke to me in a tone he had never used with me before. "Mom, you're offending Caroline. She does all this to help you, and you accuse her of being dishonest." "I'm not accusing her of anything," I tried to defend myself. "I just want to understand where my money is going." Matthew shook his head in frustration. "Your money is going to maintain this house where we all live. It's not enough that Caroline dedicates her time to managing your finances without you questioning her." I fell silent. Not because I agreed, but because I saw something in my son's eyes that frightened me. He no longer saw me as his mother. He saw me as a problem that needed to be solved. The days grew darker after that. Caroline started entering my room without knocking. I could be changing clothes or resting, and she would just open the door as if it were nothing. I need to check the closet, she'd say. You have too much old clothes that needs to be thrown out. One day, I came back from my permitted Sunday walk and found 3 trash bags in the hallway. When I opened them, I discovered my clothes inside. Dresses I had worn on special occasions, sweaters my husband had given me, clothes that were still in perfect condition. Why are my clothes in the trash? I asked, feeling tears burning in my eyes. Caroline was on the sofa, painting her nails. You don't wear it anymore. It's taking up space we need. I pulled a dress from the bag. It was the dress I wore to Matthew's college graduation. I do wear it. This is my clothing. Caroline snorted. Susan, that dress is like 20 years old. Nobody wears that anymore. You look ridiculous in that stuff. I rescued what I could from those bags and hid it under my bed. But the following week, when I returned from the grocery store, the clothes were gone again. I searched the whole apartment and couldn't find them. Caroline looked at me with innocence when I asked, I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you forgot that you already threw it out. But I hadn't thrown it out. She had, and I had no way to prove it. People I didn't know started coming to the apartment. Caroline's friends, who sat in my living room, used my mugs, left their things lying around. I would hide in my room when they came, because Caroline didn't even bother to introduce me. One afternoon, I heard their laughter from my room and dared to come out for some water. The 3 women sitting on my sofa looked at me as if I were the intruder. That's the mother-in-law, I heard Caroline tell one of them in a low voice, but not so low that I couldn't hear, the one I told you about. The women looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. One of them even had the decency to look uncomfortable. But I just stood there, frozen, holding my glass of water, feeling the weight of their stares. What had Caroline told them about me? What stories did she invent when I wasn't present? The things I valued began to disappear. First, it was my husband's watch, which I kept on my nightstand. Then, the gold earrings my mother had left me. When I asked Caroline if she had seen them, she told me I must have lost them. You forget where you put things, Susan. You should be more careful. But I hadn't lost them. I knew exactly where they were, and one day they just weren't there anymore. I couldn't accuse Caroline without proof. Matthew would never believe me. He was already convinced that I was becoming forgetful, confused, difficult. Every time I tried to talk to him alone, Caroline would appear. It was like she had radar for detecting when her husband and I were having a conversation. She would interject, change the subject, or simply pull Matthew away with some excuse. One night, desperate, I waited for Caroline to leave for one of her girls' nights. I sat with Matthew in the living room, just like we used to, back when it was just him and me. Son, I need to talk to you. He sighed, not looking up from his phone. What is it, Mom? I took a deep breath. I'm not happy. I feel like I don't have any space in my own house anymore. I feel like Caroline treats me like I'm a nuisance. Matthew finally looked at me. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Mom, Caroline does everything for you. She cooks, she cleans, she manages your finances. I don't understand what you're complaining about. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't ask her to do those things. I can cook my own food, clean my own house. This is my house, Matthew. I paid for it, and I feel like it doesn't belong to me anymore. My son stood up. That's exactly the problem, Mom. You keep thinking this is just your house, but we all live here now. We have to share the space. And if Caroline makes decisions, it's because she's trying to make things work better for everyone. I stood up too, feeling desperation growing in my chest. And I don't have a voice in those decisions? I don't have the right to an opinion about what happens in my own home? Matthew rubbed his face with his hands. You're being selfish. Caroline and I gave you a home. We take care of you. We worry about you. And all you do is complain. His words hit me like a bucket of cold water. Gave me a home? I already had a home. It was my home. But apparently, to my son, I was supposed to be grateful that they were allowing me to live in my own house. That night, when Caroline returned, I heard them talking in their room again. Your mom is being impossible, Caroline said. She almost yelled at me today because I moved some things. She's getting more and more agitated. Matthew mumbled something. I think we need to seriously consider that assisted living facility, Caroline continued. We can't keep going like this. She is ruining our marriage. I stood on the other side of the wall, holding back my sobs. I didn't want them to hear me. I didn't want to give them any more reasons to say I was agitated, that I was losing it. But inside, I was falling apart. My son, the child I had carried in my arms, the one I had raised alone after his father died, was considering putting me in a home because his wife wanted him to. The days that followed were a silent hell. Caroline didn't even bother to hide her contempt anymore. She spoke to me with orders, not requests. Stay in your room. We have guests. Don't touch that. Don't go out today. And I obeyed. Because I was tired. Because I no longer had the strength to fight. Because I was starting to believe that maybe they were right, and I was wrong. I stopped eating properly. I had no appetite. Food tasted like nothing. I lost nearly 20 pounds in 2 months. My neighbors started to notice when they saw me in the hallway. "Susan, are you all right? You look so thin, Mrs." Davis would say. I would just smile and nod. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't admit out loud that I was wasting away, that every day I felt like I was losing another piece of myself. The moment that changed everything came on a Sunday afternoon. My cousin Janet had called to say she was coming to visit. I hadn't seen her in months, not since before Matthew and Caroline moved in. Janet lived in another state and only came to the city twice a year. I was excited. I needed to see a friendly face, someone who remembered who I was before all this. I spent the morning tidying up the living room. Well, trying to. Everything I moved, Caroline moved back with an exaggerated sigh. "What are you doing?" she asked with annoyance. "My cousin Janet is coming. I want everything to look nice." Caroline crossed her arms. "I didn't know you were having company. You didn't tell me." I felt irritation rising in my chest. "I don't have to tell you. She's my cousin." Caroline looked at me with that expression I knew so well. That mix of contempt and amusement, as if I were a joke only she understood. "Of course you have to tell me. We all live here. Besides, the house is a mess. You're making me look bad." I was about to scream that it was my house and I could invite whomever I wanted, but I held back. I didn't want to start a fight before Janet arrived. Janet rang the doorbell at 3 o'clock on the dot. I opened the door, and her immediate smile filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. "Cousin," she exclaimed, hugging me tightly. But when she pulled back, her smile faded a little. "Susan, you're so thin. Are you eating okay?" I tried to laugh and change the subject. "I'm fine. Come in. I want you to meet Caroline, Matthew's wife." We entered the living room, where Caroline was sitting on the sofa, looking at her phone. She didn't even look up when we walked in. "Caroline, this is my cousin Janet." Janet extended her hand with a friendly smile. "Nice to meet you. Susan has told me so much about you." Caroline gave her a limp, uninterested handshake and returned her attention to her phone. "Hi." Nothing else. Just that. The atmosphere became awkward immediately. Janet looked at me, confused, and I tried to hide the embarrassment I felt. We sat down on the armchairs and began to talk, catching up on family, on her life, on everything that had happened in the last few months. But Caroline was still there, on the sofa, not moving. It wasn't that she was participating in the conversation. She was just there, listening, judging. "Would you like some coffee, Janet?" I offered, getting up. My cousin nodded gratefully. I headed to the kitchen, and Janet followed me, leaving Caroline alone in the living room. As I prepared the coffee, Janet spoke in a low voice. "Cousin, is everything all right? You look exhausted, and so thin." I forced a smile. "I'm fine. It's just been a difficult few months of adjustment." Janet put her hand on mine. "You don't seem like yourself. Does Matthew know how you look?" My eyes filled with tears without permission. I tried to blink them back, but Janet had already seen them. "Susan, what is going on here?" I was about to answer, about to let out everything I had been holding in for months, when Caroline appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The coffee smells good," she said, her voice sweet, but her eyes were cold. She just stood there, clearly listening to our conversation. Janet looked at me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't. I finished making the coffee in silence, and we returned to the living room. The tension was palpable. Janet tried several times to restart the conversation, but Caroline always found a way to interrupt or make sarcastic comments. "Susan, are you still going to your knitting class?" Janet asked. Before I could answer, Caroline chimed in. "She doesn't go anymore. She was getting too tired, and Matthew thought it was better for her to rest." Janet looked at me, surprised. "You don't go? But you loved that class." I nodded weakly. "Yes, but things have changed." Caroline smiled smugly. "Susan is at an age where she needs more care. That's why Matthew and I are here, to make sure she's okay." The way she said it, with that condescending tone, as if I were an invalid, made me feel small. I saw Janet frown, clearly annoyed by the comment, but she said nothing. Then Matthew arrived. He walked in the door with a takeout bag. "Hi," he said, surprised to see Janet. "I didn't know we had company." Janet stood up to greet him. "Matthew, it's been so long. I came to visit your mom." Matthew smiled, but it was a tense smile. He looked at Caroline, who returned a look loaded with meaning. One of those silent exchanges that couples have, which everyone else can feel but not decipher. Caroline stood up and walked over to Matthew. "Your mom didn't tell us her cousin was coming." "I would have prepared something special." There was a reproach in her voice, though she tried to sound casual. Matthew looked at me with that expression that had become so familiar. Disappointment. As if I had done something wrong. "Mom, you should let us know when you invite people over." I felt the humiliation flush my cheeks. Janet felt it too, because she stood up abruptly. I called to say I was coming. Susan shouldn't have to ask for permission for her cousin to visit. Her voice was firm, defensive. Matthew shrugged. "It's not about permission. It's about coordination. We all live here." Caroline moved closer to Matthew, taking his arm possessively. "It's just that Susan forgets to tell us things sometimes. You know, at her age." Janet looked at me, waiting for me to defend myself, to say something. But I couldn't. I was too embarrassed, too tired. I saw her open her mouth, ready to say something else, but I shook my head subtly. I didn't want to cause more trouble. The visit ended shortly after that. Janet said goodbye with a long hug, whispering in my ear, "Call me. Please, call me." I nodded without saying anything. When I closed the door behind her, I felt as if I had closed the door on my last connection to the outside world. Matthew and Caroline were already in the kitchen, and I could hear their low, angry voices. "Your cousin is nosy," Caroline was saying. "You can tell she's filling your mom's head with ideas." Matthew mumbled something I couldn't hear. I stood in the hallway, invisible in my own home, listening to them talk about me as if I didn't exist. "You should talk to her," Caroline continued. "Tell her not to come over without an invitation. It just makes your mom more agitated." That night, at dinner, no one spoke. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. I ate mechanically, not really tasting the food. Matthew stared at his plate, frowning. Caroline ate with precise, satisfied movements. When I finished, I stood up to take my plate to the kitchen. Caroline spoke without looking at me. "Susan, we need to talk about visitors. You can't keep bringing people over without notice." Something in me snapped. I dropped the plate in the sink with more force than necessary. "She's my cousin. I have a right to see my family." Caroline stood up, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. "It's not just your house anymore, Susan. How many times do we have to tell you?" Her voice was low, but loaded with venom. "If you're going to live here with us, you have to follow the rules." Matthew stood up too, getting between us. But not to defend me, to calm the situation. "Mom, please don't make this harder." I looked at him, searching his eyes for any trace of the boy he had been, the son who had promised to always take care of me. But that boy wasn't there anymore. In his place was a man who had chosen his wife over his mother. "Harder for who, Matthew?" I asked, feeling the tears well up. "Harder for you? For her? Because for me, it's already impossible." Caroline crossed her arms. There she goes again with the drama, always playing the victim. I turned to her, all the rage I had held in for months finally surfacing. "I'm not the victim. I'm the owner of this house, and I'm tired of being treated like an unwanted guest." Caroline laughed. She actually laughed. A short, cruel laugh. The owner? Please. Susan, if it weren't for us, you'd be alone in this apartment, talking to the walls. You should be thanking us for being here. Her words hit me with the force of a slap. Matthew said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't ask his wife to apologize. He just stood there, staring at the floor. I want you to leave, I said, my voice trembling. I want my house back. I want my life back. Caroline took a step toward me, her face now inches from mine. We're not going anywhere. And if you have such a problem with us being here, maybe you're the one who should leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew finally looked up, but not to support me. Mom, you need to apologize to Caroline. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Apologize? For what? Matthew sighed. For talking to her like that. For being so selfish. Caroline is just trying to help. And you attack her. I looked at my son. I really looked at him. And for the first time, I understood that I had lost him. He was no longer the son who loved me. He was the son who saw me as a burden. I went to my room without apologizing. I closed the door and sat on the bed, shaking. I could hear their voices on the other side, talking about me. Tears ran down my face unchecked. That night, I understood that I had reached my limit. That if I didn't do something soon, I was going to lose myself completely. I was going to become a ghost in my own life. The days after Janet's visit were the darkest of my life. Caroline stopped pretending entirely. There was no more feigned courtesy, no more fake smiles. She treated me with an open contempt that Matthew seemed not to see, or worse, chose to ignore. I had become a piece of old furniture in my own home, something taking up space that everyone wished would disappear. I started spending most of my time locked in my room. It was the only place I could breathe without feeling like I was bothering someone. I would sit on the bed, staring out the window, watching the hours pass. I no longer cooked, because Caroline had declared the kitchen her territory. I no longer cleaned, because she said I did it wrong. I no longer went out, because there was always a reason for me to stay home. One morning, 2 weeks after the fight, I woke up and found my bedroom door open. I always closed it before I slept. Always. I looked around and noticed that things had been moved. My jewelry box was in a different position. The drawers of my dresser weren't completely closed. Someone had been going through my things while I slept. I got up, my heart pounding, and checked the jewelry box. The few pieces I had left were still there, but my emergency money was gone. I kept $200 in cash in an envelope inside the box. Money I had saved, bit by bit, cents I put away whenever I could. It was my security, my escape plan if I ever needed one. And now it was gone. I left the room, shaking with rage. Caroline was in the living room, putting on makeup in front of a mirror. Someone was in my room, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't even look at me. It must have been Matthew, looking for something, but I knew it hadn't been Matthew. Money was stolen. Caroline finally turned, an expression of boredom on her face. You probably just forgot where you put it. You know how you get. I didn't forget anything, I insisted. I had $200 in my jewelry box, and now it's gone. Caroline shrugged and went back to her makeup. Maybe Matthew borrowed it. Ask him when he gets home. But when Matthew got home that night and I asked him, he denied taking the money. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. Mom, maybe you spent it and don't remember. Or maybe you put it somewhere else. I know where I put my money, I said, feeling tears of helplessness welling up. Someone came into my room while I was sleeping and stole it. Caroline appeared in the living room, arms crossed. Are you accusing me of stealing your money, Susan? Her voice was dangerously calm. I didn't accuse anyone, I replied. I just said my money is missing. Matthew rubbed his face tiredly. Mom, you can't just go around accusing people without proof. Caroline would never do something like that. That night I cried until I had no tears left. Not just for the lost money. Although $200 was a lot to me, I cried because I understood that I was completely defenseless. That they could do whatever they wanted to me, and no one would believe me. Matthew had chosen to believe his wife over his own mother. I was the crazy one, the forgetful one, the one who made things up. The next few days were a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Caroline started having more friends over. They would take over the living room, play loud music, laugh, and talk as if I didn't exist. When I came out of my room to use the bathroom or get water, their conversations would stop. They would look at me with curiosity, as if I were an animal on display. One of them even asked Caroline in a low voice but loud enough for me to hear, "Is that the mother-in-law you told us about?" I would lock myself in my room, holding it in, just to avoid having to walk through the living room full of strangers. My bladder ached, but my dignity ached more. Sometimes I would hear them laughing and wonder if they were laughing at me. If Caroline was telling them stories about the crazy old lady who lived in the back room, the old lady who forgot things, the old lady who accused people of stealing. One afternoon, while they were all gathered in the living room, I heard Caroline on the phone. Her voice was loud enough for me to hear from my room. "Yeah, it's hard living with her. No, she doesn't realize what a burden she is. Matthew is exhausted, but he doesn't want to put her in a home because he feels guilty." Every word was a nail in my heart. That's how they saw me. As a burden. As a problem to be solved. I stopped eating almost completely. Food was a knot in my throat. I lost more weight. My clothes were huge on me. The neighbors who saw me in the hall asked if I was sick. I just smiled and said I was fine, because admitting the truth meant admitting that I had failed, that I couldn't keep my son's love, that I couldn't defend my own home. One morning I woke up and didn't want to get out of bed. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, with no strength to face another day. I heard Matthew and Caroline getting ready to leave. I heard the door close. And I stayed there, in the silence, thinking that maybe it would be easier if I just ceased to exist. If I just disappeared, like everyone seemed to want. But then my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Janet. "Susan, I got your number from Mrs. Davis. I'm worried about you. You haven't returned my calls." I hadn't returned her calls because I didn't know how to explain what was happening, how to tell her I was falling apart. "I'm fine." I lied, my voice cracking. Janet didn't believe me. "You don't sound fine. I'm coming to see you tomorrow." I tried to dissuade her, to tell her it wasn't necessary, but she had already decided. "I'll see you tomorrow at 2. And Susan, don't tell Matthew or Caroline I'm coming." She hung up before I could protest. I spent the rest of the day in a state of anxiety. Part of me wanted to see Janet desperately. Another part was terrified of what would happen if Caroline found out. The next day, at 2 o'clock, Janet knocked on the door. I was alone in the apartment. Matthew was at work, and Caroline had gone out. I opened the door, and Janet froze when she saw me. "My God, Susan, what is happening to you?" She hugged me, and in that hug, all the walls I had built came crashing down. I cried like I hadn't cried in months. Sobs that came from the deepest part of my chest. Janet led me to the living room, and I sat down, unable to stop crying. "Tell me everything," she said, taking my hands in hers. And for the first time in months, I talked. I told her everything. About how Caroline had taken control of my house, about how my money had disappeared, about how Matthew no longer saw me as his mother, but as a problem, about how I felt invisible, useless, unwanted in my own home. Janet listened, her face growing more and more serious. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she said something that would change everything. "Susan, this isn't right. What they are doing to you is not right. And you have options, you have rights. This is your house. Legally, it's yours." I looked at her, not understanding. What can I do? Matthew won't believe me. And Caroline, she has all the control. Janet took out her phone and looked something up. "I know a lawyer. She specializes in elder abuse cases." "Yes, Susan, this is abuse. Emotional abuse, financial manipulation, isolation. You can do something about this." I felt a flash of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, but also fear. What if Matthew never forgives me? What if I lose him forever? Janet squeezed my hands. "Cousin, you've already lost him. The Matthew you knew, the son who loved you, isn't here anymore. That woman changed him. But you are still here. You can still save yourself. She was right. I knew she was right. But taking that step, seeking help, confronting the situation, it required a strength I wasn't sure I had. Think about it, Janet said, writing the lawyer's number on a piece of paper. But don't wait too long. I've seen cases like this before. They only get worse. And cousin, you don't deserve this. You deserve to live in peace, in your own home, without fear. She left soon after, not before hugging me tight and making me promise to call her. I was left alone in the living room, holding the paper with the lawyer's number. When Matthew and Caroline got home that night, I was in my room. Caroline entered without knocking, as always. Did you have company today? My heart stopped. No, I lied. She looked at me suspiciously. Mrs. Davis told me she saw someone enter the building. A woman. I swallowed. She must have been mistaken. Caroline stared at me for a few more seconds. Then she left without another word. That night, lying in the dark, I pulled out the paper Janet had given me. I read it over and over in the light of my phone. A number. Just a number. But that number represented a possibility. A way out. A way to get my life back. I fell asleep with the paper clutched in my hand, feeling for the first time in months that maybe, just maybe, all was not lost. I stared at that piece of paper for 3 days before I dared to call. 3 days of an internal war between fear and desperation. Finally, on a Tuesday morning, when Matthew was at work and Caroline had gone out with her friends, I dialed the number with trembling hands. Law offices of Evans and Associates, a professional voice answered. I was silent for a second. Hello, my cousin gave me this number. She said Miss Evans might be able to help me. The receptionist was kind. What is the nature of your inquiry? I took a deep breath. I think I'm being mistreated in my own home. They gave me an appointment for the next day. I hung up the phone feeling dizzy. I had taken the first step. There was no turning back. I barely slept that night, rehearsing in my mind what I would say to the lawyer. I was afraid she wouldn't believe me. I was afraid she would tell me there was nothing to be done. But more than that, I was afraid of continuing to live as I had been. The next morning, I told Caroline I had a doctor's appointment. She barely looked up from her phone. What for? Routine checkup. I lied. She asked no more questions. I left the apartment feeling like I was doing something forbidden, something dangerous. But I also felt something akin to freedom. Miss Evans's office was downtown. It was a modest building, but clean. I went up to the 3rd floor and entered a small waiting room. A woman in her 50s came out to greet me. Mrs. Miller? I'm Laura Evans. Please, come in. Her voice was warm, but professional. It made me feel safe. I sat across from her desk, and she watched me attentively. Tell me what's going on. And so, for the second time in a week, I told my story. But this time was different. Miss Evans took notes. She asked specific questions. She didn't judge me. Do you have proof that the apartment is in your name? I nodded. I have the deed saved. Bank statements? Anything showing the management of your money? I shook my head. Caroline has all of that. The lawyer leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Miller, what you're describing is a clear case of financial and emotional abuse. Your daughter-in-law has no legal right to control your money or prevent you from accessing your own home. You are the owner. They are residents by your permission, which you can revoke at any time. Her words hit me like a wave. I can revoke their permission? I can ask them to leave? But he's my son, I said, my voice breaking. I don't want to hurt him. The lawyer looked at me with compassion. I understand, but your son is allowing his wife to mistreat you. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even with family. She explained my options. I could file for a restraining order. I could change the locks. I could regain access to my bank account. I could, legally, take my house back. How much would all this cost? I asked, dreading the answer. For you, nothing. I work on a pro bono basis for seniors in abusive situations. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. This stranger was offering me help, expecting nothing in return. I need you to bring me your deed, your ID, and any bank documents you can get. In the meantime, I'll prepare the necessary papers. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in months. power, control, hope. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. I asked to speak to a manager and explained that I needed to review my account. He showed me the transactions from the last few months. My heart sank as I saw the truth in numbers. Caroline had been withdrawing money constantly, small amounts that added up to over $2,000. I need to remove another person's access to my account, I told the manager. He nodded and processed the change immediately. Would you like a new card? I nodded. He gave me a temporary card and told me the permanent one would arrive in a week. I left the bank with the card hidden in my bra. I couldn't risk Caroline finding it. That night, at dinner, Caroline was particularly annoyed. I tried to buy something today and your card was declined. She looked at me accusatorially. I shrugged, feigning confusion. Oh, there must be a problem with the bank. I'll call tomorrow, Matthew chimed in. Mom, you need to fix that. Caroline needs access to your account to pay the bills. I'll fix it, I said calmly, but I didn't fix it. Instead, I continued to gather documents. I found my deed in an old box in my closet. I collected receipts, photographs of my things that had disappeared, and I wrote down dates and events. Every night, after Matthew and Caroline fell asleep, I worked on my case. I became a detective in my own life. A week later, I returned to Miss Evans's office with everything I had compiled. She reviewed the documents carefully. This is enough. We can proceed, she explained the plan. We would change the locks on a day they weren't home. We would serve Matthew a formal letter explaining they had to find another place to live. If they tried to force their way in, it would be considered trespassing. When? I asked. When do you want to do it? I thought about all the months of humiliation. My stolen money, my missing things, the way Caroline looked at me with contempt, the way Matthew had stopped seeing me as his mother. Soon, I said. I want to do it soon, Miss Evans called a trusted locksmith. We agreed he would come on a Friday afternoon when Matthew was at work and Caroline usually went out with her friends. We would have a 2-hour window to change all the locks. Are you sure about this? The lawyer asked me. I nodded. For the first time in months, I was completely sure of something. Friday arrived faster than I expected. I got up early, my stomach churning with nerves. Matthew left for work as usual, not noticing anything different about me. Caroline left shortly after noon, just like every Friday. I watched her walk away from the window and waited 10 more minutes to make sure she wasn't coming back for something she forgot. At 2 o'clock, the locksmith arrived, accompanied by Miss Evans. They brought 3 new, high-security locks. I watched as they removed the old ones, those locks that had protected my home for years, but that no longer protected me. Every screw they removed was a piece of my old life falling away. Every new lock they installed was a step toward my freedom. The job took exactly 1 hour and a half. When they finished, Miss Peopley, Evans handed me a set of new keys. I held them in my hand, feeling their weight. They were mine. Only mine. No one else had access to my home now. Do you have everything ready? The lawyer asked. I nodded. She handed me the envelope we had prepared. Inside was a formal letter, copies of my deed, the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, and a legal document stating that Matthew and Caroline had 30 days to vacate the property. If you need anything, call me. Anytime, miss, Evans said before she left. I was left alone in my apartment, which for the first time in months truly felt like mine. I walked through every room, touching my things, reacquainting myself with my space. I cried, but not from sadness. I cried from relief. I barely slept that night. I knew what was coming. I knew Caroline would try to get in at 6 in the morning, as she always did after her nights out with her friends. I made myself some tea and sat in the living room, waiting. The hours passed slowly. At 5:30, then 5:45. I heard footsteps in the hall. Then, the moment I had been waiting for, and dreading, the sound of Caroline's keys trying to open the lock. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, silence. And then, the scream. That scream that woke up the entire building. What? This can't be. I heard her pounding on the door, trying the keys again. Susan, open this door right now. I sat there, calmly, waiting. I heard Matthew running up, his voice confused. What's wrong? What's going on? Your mother changed the locks. My keys won't go in. I can't get into my own house. Matthew pounded on the door. Mom, open up. Let's just talk about this. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. I didn't open it all the way, just cracked it open enough to see their faces. Matthew was disheveled, confused. Caroline was furious, her makeup smeared. How could you do this? Matthew yelled. I didn't answer with words. I pulled out the envelope I had prepared and handed it to him. Matthew took it with trembling hands. He opened it and began to read. I watched his face change with every line. Shock, disbelief, shame. Caroline snatched the papers from him, and her eyes went wide when she saw the bank statements. This can't be true. But it was. It was all documented. Every withdrawal, every lie, every instance of abuse. The neighbors started coming out of their apartments. Mrs. Davis looked at me with approval. Others watched the scene with curiosity. Matthew tried to speak. Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know she. I cut him off. My voice firm. Yes, you did, Matthew. You always knew. You just chose not to see it. Caroline tried to push past me, but I kept my hand on the door. You have 30 days to get your things. Any attempt to enter without my permission will be considered trespassing. You can't do this, Caroline screamed. We're family. I looked her directly in the eyes. Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't humiliate. Family doesn't turn your home into a prison. I closed the door gently and slid the deadbolt. On the other side, I heard Caroline scream something else, but their voices couldn't reach me anymore. They no longer had power over me. I walked away from the door and sat on my sofa. My hands were shaking, but it was from adrenaline, not fear. It was over. I had my house back. I had my life back. The screaming eventually stopped. I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. Silence. An hour later, there was a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Davis. Susan, are you all right? I opened the door, and she came in, carrying donuts and coffee. You should have done this months ago, she said tenderly. We all knew what was happening. We all saw it. Other neighbors came by too. They hugged me, told me I was brave, offered their support. For the first time in months, my living room was filled with genuine laughter, real conversation, true affection. That afternoon, Janet called. You did it. I did it, I replied, and we both cried with joy on the phone. Barbara called too, having gotten my number back. I always knew you were stronger than you thought, she said. The following days were strange but liberating. Matthew called several times. At first, he tried to convince me to change my mind. Then he tried to negotiate. Finally, he just asked for permission to get their things. We agreed on a day and time. He came with Caroline, but she didn't say a word to me. They packed in silence while I watched from the living room. Before they left, Matthew stopped in front of me. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I looked him in the eyes. I'm sorry too, son. I'm sorry you chose to lose me. No, he replied. He just picked up his boxes and left. I closed the door behind them and knew that chapter of my life was over. The weeks passed. I went back to my knitting class. I reconnected with my friends. I painted my bedroom walls a new color. I bought new plants. Slowly, I turned my house back into a home. My home. A place where I decided who came in and who stayed out. A place where my voice mattered. A place where I mattered. A month later, Matthew tried to visit. He knocked on the door one Sunday afternoon. I opened it and saw him standing there, alone, without Caroline. Can I come in? I looked at him for a long moment. I saw my son, but I also saw the man who had abandoned me when I needed him most. No, Matthew, you can't. His eyes filled with tears. Mom, please. I want to fix things. Fixing things takes time, I said calmly, and it requires you to really understand what you did. I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe someday. I closed the door gently, not with anger, not with pain, with peace. Because I had learned something fundamental. Self-love is not selfishness. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not a sin. I sat on my sofa, in my living room, in my house. The sun came through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I took a sip of my tea and smiled. I was 64 years old, and I had just learned the most important lesson of my life. It's never too late to get your dignity back. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. It's never too late to choose yourself. And if one day Matthew truly changed, if one day he understood what he had allowed to happen, maybe we could rebuild something. But it would be on my terms, in my space, with my rules, because this was my house, my life, my peace. And no one, not even my own son, would ever take it from me again.